We're just over a week from Rachel Reeves' second budget that was full of U-turns. And one of the most important U-turns was her decision to lift the two-child benefit cap. Labour have moved at light speed. At the start of the year, they were suspending the whip from MPs who were voting for the cap to be lifted. And Rachel Reeves was pretty vocal in her opposition to the cap being lifted. In fact, I think it's worth playing a clip.
It costs more than £3 billion a year. And we were really clear during the election that we were not going to make spending commitments without being able to say where the money was going to come from. And if I said to you now, we're going to make those changes this year or next year or the year after, you would rightly say, where's the money going to come from that? If we're not able to say where the money is going to come from, we can't promise to do it. And that's true when it comes to the two-child limit and anything else. But if you ask, are we going to lift kids out of poverty? Absolutely we are.
But come the budget, she seems to have changed her mind.
I can announce today, fully costed and fully funded, the removal of the two-child limit in full from April.
But will scrapping the cap even work? Will this policy decision, will this measure bring the 500,000 children out of poverty that Labour MPs and people like Gordon Brown seem convinced it will? I'm not so sure. I'm Michael Simmons, and welcome to Reality Check. Less spin, more stats. One of the organisations that were quite heavily involved with lobbying the Chancellor to make this decision, along with Gordon Brown, who's been arguing for this for a long time, are the Resolution Foundation. They're fairly influential for a think tank because they used to be run by Torsten Bell. And Torsten Bell, of course, is now in the Treasury. And he was the person who the Chancellor tasked with finding the revenue raisers, for her to boost taxes. It's interesting then that in the summer, they began quite actively campaigning against the cap. And as part of their campaign, they had this graph of child poverty rates. It suggests that we've done nothing on child poverty, that the rate is flat today. But we've got the figures since 1960. They seem to suggest that the amount of children living in poverty is over double the amount it was in the early 1960s. Does Britain seem like it has millions of children roaming the streets in poverty? In fact, in the 60s, something like 3 million families with children were estimated to be living in slum conditions. The problem is how this metric is defined. You might think of poverty, or I certainly would think of poverty about being about having access to the resources that are important to life, having a comfortable roof over your head, having access to education, having access to food, having access to medicine, just access to, the resources that you need to live. But that's not what relative poverty measures at all. In fact, it just measures income inequality. It's defined as being below 60% of the median earnings, so what the average person earns. And obviously, that changes over time. Now, the result of that metric, clearly, is that when the whole society is poorer, you get this converse effect where it makes poverty look like it's not as bad as perhaps it might be. Now, Labour hope that by lifting this cap, they're going to move families up the income spectrum and therefore, improve that poverty metric, improve that poverty position. But to illustrate just how flawed this is as a metric, that median figure would come down. And the result would be that child poverty has gone down as well. Not because anything in these children's lives had materially changed. They hadn't moved into a bigger house, they didn't have parents who were suddenly earning more. Just because of the way this metric is defined. The average earnings of the whole economy would come down, and therefore, relatively, they would be better off. But does anyone really think that that tells us anything about whether we're tackling poverty or not? In fact, it's worse than this. And this is why people like Gordon Brown deliberately want to use this kind of metric because it means that there's no way to improve a society unless you close this wealth and income inequality gap. But using a poverty metric to make the argument seems wrong to me. It's certainly misleading. I personally would say I don't care what income inequality is. I don't care how many billionaires we have, as long as those at the bottom are being dragged up too. And this is a metric that's just designed to mean that doesn't happen. There's a slightly more accurate metric we can rely on though, which is absolute poverty. And that doesn't take the median in a moving year. It takes it at a fixed point. So you don't get this effect of as median incomes change, so too does the metric. And that shows a completely different picture. In fact, since the 60s, child poverty has absolutely collapsed. And that's something surely every person of every government should be proud of. That brings me on to the second point I wanted to make in this episode, and how decisions like this in the budget, as well as the other decisions to increase welfare spending, mean that we're building an economy that's about welfare and not about work, and about how I think, regardless of what you do with the cap, that will actually make things worse for children. Now, I want to illustrate this with some examples, which have kindly been provided by the Centre for Social Justice. So they give this pretty stark example of an out-of-work family, so neither of the parents are working, with 3 children. Now, if they've got universal credit, as well as housing and health benefits, and crucially PIP, which this kind of combination now is not rare, given how easily PIP and health-related benefits are handed out, especially now that the majority of claims are for mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. So with 3 kids, their family take-home income is something like £46,000. Add the rarer cases, which I guess might now become a lot more common, where there's 5 children, that figure rises to £55,000. But what if you compare that to a working family? And let's choose quite a typical low-income working family where you've got one parent is in full-time work at the minimum wage or the national living wage, and the other parent is doing part-time hours. Their take-home pay would be £28,000. That's £18,000 less than the family that are reliant on welfare and not in jobs. And in fact, to illustrate just how bad, how stark that difference is, if the working family wanted to change their position in life to just match the level of the benefit-seeking family, they'd need to get a combined salary of £71,000. How can that be right in a society where we want to encourage work? But the trouble is, this is likely to actually make poverty and the general life chances of children a lot worse. It's hard to see what material difference lifting this cap would make to those children. But what we know certainly makes a difference to children is whether their parents are in work or not. Children growing up in workless households are over 4 times more likely to be materially deprived. So it doesn't matter about the benefits cap. This, ingrained culture of worklessness follows these kids throughout their life. And surely we should want to tackle the real, measurable metrics that really matter about the lives of children and the life of all British people, rather than a metric that's got more political purpose than anything economic.